All right, so for discussing our chapter 10 in Mbiti about the ethnic group, kinship, and the individual, I want to suggest that there are three meta discourses, kind of big issue discourses, that will help you get into his otherwise very clear, detailed, interesting information. The first one, the first issue, will be, I'll call it From Races to Ethnicity and Indigenous Religions. So we're going to look at his use of the word races at the beginning. But we're not going to get stuck there because he doesn't get stuck there. Secondly, we're going to look at the impact of colonialism on African tradition as it shows up twice in this chapter and get a sense of what are those underlying forces. Colonialism was not an idea that I grew up understanding, and so maybe I can lay some of that foundation for you. All right, so then how does the unique place of the third issue, let's call it the tension between the individual and society. And I want to suggest that it's a little bit different. Every culture has their tension between the role of the individual and society. And that because of the emphasis on geography, place, and genealogy, then the tension that we see between being an individual and being a member of society is quite interesting, quite unique. So let me try to unpack these as quickly as I can. So academic conversations about race have come a long way since Mbiti wrote this text. If we look at Chittister, who's much more contemporary, in his second paragraph, the idea of, he notes that the academics got implicated in colonialism at the time of trying to, let me just read the doggone notes. The idea of tribe or tribalism in academic studies of Africa can be traced to a moment in time when colonizing governments were trying to organize the people they wanted to conquer. And academics played into this game by providing information about distinct tribes. Chittister notes that what were really dynamic and regionally affiliated African political groups were described, instead of being political groups, as having physical essences that were tribal, ethnic, or racial. So regional political identity was transformed into biological racial identity, let's say from roughly 1800s through early 1900s and into the 20th century. And that the tribal names became reified, Chittister tells us, during colonial rule. So then, prior to that, one would have known oneself for one's genealogy and alliances. And after that, one would know oneself as a Hutu or Tutsi, for instance, as right. So the meaning of tribe was a product of colonialism. Now, in contrast to Mbiti's use of that phrase in that intro of races, the word ethnicity represents a more contemporary academic understanding of the social fabric in which identities are constructed. And some of you are probably doing some anthropology or this or that. We can move past the idea of race in Mbiti's chapter because his attention to detail in the rest of the chapter really moves us so beautifully out of the idea that this had to do with what was in your blood, and so much more into the way a community is knit into an alliance. So we're going to throw down the word race and we're going to pick up the word ethnicity. Another word that Mbiti uses that's very helpful to us, and this is one I encourage you to pick up for the rest of the semester, is indigenous. So indigenous means native to the land. It's a good word for describing humans as part of a complex ecology who have come from African roots. So indigenous implies a kind of chthonic origin in a region, yes? It's coming up from the roots, coming up from the ground, an indigenous plant to the region, an indigenous person. It has that kind of chthonic tie to it. It's fair to say that our study of African traditional religions is focused on indigenous traditions. While it is difficult to say whether first century Christianity established in northern Africa and then now prevalent across Africa, or 7th century Islam, like, are those traditional at this point in Africa? But what we can say is that those traditions are not indigenous to Africa. Those traditions are indigenous to a Middle East and a whole Mediterranean notion of a revelatory God whose presence gets written in text, and monotheistic traditions. So those are indigenous to the Middle East, whereas the African traditions grew from local experience out of ancient oral traditions and the geographical features of the land. And that means, so what we're doing this semester, it would be more accurate to say that we're studying indigenous African religions. All right, so that's from race to ethnicity and to indigenous. Point 1. Point 2. There are 2 important points that Mbiti raises about the impact of colonialism in Africa. And they help us to understand that colonialism was like a huge tectonic plate that grinded over much of the African continent. Beginning with the Portuguese traders of the 14th century, they swiftly established the beginnings of the European slave trade, which hit its height in the 18th and 19th centuries, removing approximately 11 million Africans and establishing European styles of government, transportation, and a language across the region. Now, for those of you familiar with the geology of Wyoming, you might appreciate colonialism as a continental went all the way across Africa, social orogeny, right? The Laramide orogeny is the one that's most impacted Wyoming. Well, colonialism is like a social orogeny that changed the cultural landscape of indigenous African people as effectively as our Rocky Mountains have risen. A Google definition of orogeny is, quote, a process in which a section of the Earth's crust is folded and deformed by lateral compression to form a mountain range. So let's say that the incursions of European colonial governments were the lateral compression that folded and deformed the landscape such that indigenous African traditions were stretched, strained, plowed under, mowed over, divided externally and internally, and they had to adapt to maintain the cultural fabric as well as they could. So here's 2 points, very subtle little points in this chapter. Mbiti touches the tip of this iceberg twice, on page 99 and 100. In his discussion of the 2,100 varieties of dialects to be found across Africa, he notes the main international languages of Africa, that is, the ones that people use to participate across ethnic differences on the continent, are French and English. Think about what that means. That the African language of Bantu, for instance, which Chittister and Mbiti both describe as major language group on the continent, it did not become the dominant international language of Africa. Rather, French and English did. So on 99, Mbiti writes, French and English are the main international languages. They are here to stay, and we might as well consider them as African languages, since they are the greatest legacy we have inherited from colonial power. And this inheritance nobody can take away from us. He then goes on to note that Arabic is the most widely spoken language in Africa, right? So non-indigenous languages become the languages that people are speaking. Mother tongues, the tongues with which 5 generations, 10 generations ago, people were singing to their children, get this lateral compression, and people have to deal with English, French, Arabic to move across markets, territories, education systems, governments, and legal systems. So colonialism hits and alters the landscape. And on page 100, here's another little note, and he describes it as part of the greatest legacy. So that is in terms of individual kinship and ethnic groups. I want you to think of them now with that crumple of English and French and Arabic over them. So then on page 100, he says, when Europe divided up the continent of Africa at the Berlin Conference of 1885, many African peoples were split by the new and often arbitrary boundaries drawn by colonial powers. This resulted in tragic situations where some members of the same tribal group came under one colonial system, while other members came under a different colonial system. This happened in Nigeria, where we'll be looking, where there was more French in the north, more English or British in the south. Rather than try to do the impossible and extremely explosive job of reversing and revising the colonial boundaries, modern African states have agreed to retain and respect these colonial boundaries, however painful they might continue to be. So there's one more rather small reference by Mbiti regarding the question of your ethnic group, kinship, and individual. But do you see how it represents this massive alteration on the landscape, so that the identity of nation state itself was an arbitrary set of line making, sometimes with tragic consequences for the people involved who got divided, who had previously been in alliances by European language difference, different colonial governments, etc. So this is a big deal, the colonialism piece. And I'm going to quit there because I think that's probably all the time I've got. So we've got one more piece to cover. Thanks.